Beneath the depths of Stirling University lies a man who ponders important questions. Not questions like, what's the meaning of life, or why are we here? But questions that center over one concept. How do I scare my audience? Tonight, he will answer that question, reading tales that are so utterly horrifying they may leave you weak at the knees. Welcome to the Spook Zone.
I'm back. Yeah. And everything's so great. I'm so happy to be back and doing things. Ladies, gentlemen, other eldritch abominations, I welcome you to the Spook Zone, the happiest show on the planet. And by that I mean, no, it's not. It's not the happiest show on the planet. You're about to get scared, maybe. I really can't tell whether or not the people who are listening to the show actually get scared or not. It's fun anyway. I get to have a fun time reading a thing, and you listen. That's all we need. Alright, so for those of you that are new to the show, I'm just going to take my jacket off because it's pretty warm in here. I feel confident saying that. If you're new to this show, this is how it goes down. I am reading from a thing called the Commemorative Edition of the Necronomicon, the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft. Here's how loud it is, and here's how big it is. Jesus, that peaked like a mother. Oh my god! I forget how big this thing is occasionally, and then I drop it, and then I remember everything. And we will also be taking a look at some internet horror stories that pique the interests of, pique my interests at least, and those interests include being scared. That's it. That's all you need. So last semester I began. I basically ended the year on a sort of cliffhanger because I began reading a story from Lovecraft called The Lurking Fear. Essentially, I read 2 parts of that, and it essentially was the tale of a bloke going to the Catskills, figuring out what the heck is going on there, because there seems to be this eldritch presence doing something bad, and he goes there with some bodyguards. They get killed. He's terrified. Finds a reporter, tries to do it again. He gets killed, and the reporter gets killed. It doesn't go well. Essentially, it doesn't go well at all. This is the next chapter of that, the aftermath of the second attack, so to speak, that he has witnessed. It's a fun time for the whole family. Hopefully it's an enjoyable experience. Hopefully it's, actually kind of frightening. Lovecraft does have a habit of going on and on and on with his descriptions, but I think it'll be fun, personally. I actually need to check if this is the right microphone. Hello. No, it's not. That's the right one. This is the good microphone. I can go like this. Hello. You see? I'm not entirely sure what that was. Okay. Now, it's been a while since I've done this, so forgive me if I make any mistakes. It's been like, like 3 months since I've been in the studio properly. So this'll be an experience for all. I hope you enjoy what I have for you. It'll be a fun time. And let us begin with part 3 of The Lurking Fear. What the red glare meant. On the tempest-racked night of November 8th, 1921, with a lantern which cast charnel shadows, I stood digging alone and idiotically in the grave of Jean Martinez. I began to dig in the afternoon because a thunderstorm was brewing, and now that it was dark and the storm had burst above the maniacally thick foliage, I was glad. I believe that my mind was partly unhinged by events since August the 5th. The demon shadow in the mansion, the general strain and disappointment, and the thing that occurred at the hamlet in an October storm. After that thing and I had dug a grave for one whose death I could not understand. I knew that others could not understand either, so let them think Arthur Monroe had wandered away, They searched but found nothing. The squatters might have understood, but I dared not frighten them more. I myself seemed strangely callous. That shock at the mansion had done something to my brain, and I could only think of the quest for a horror now grown to cataclysmic stature in my imagination, a quest which the fate of Arthur Monroe made me vow to keep silent and solitary. The scene of my excavations would alone have been enough to unnerve any ordinary man. Baleful primal trees of unholy size, age, and grotesqueness leered above me like the pillars of some hellish druidic temple, muffling the thunder, hushing the clawing wind, and admitting but little rain. Beyond the scarred trunks in the background, illuminated by faint flashes of filtered lightning, rose the damp ivied stones of the deserted mansion, while somewhat nearer was the abandoned Dutch garden, whose walks and beds were polluted by a white, fungus-fetid, overnourished vegetation that never saw full daylight. And nearest of all was the graveyard, where deformed trees tossed insane branches as their roots displaced unhollowed slabs and sucked venom from what lay below. Now and then, beneath the brown pall of leaves that rotted and festered in the antediluvian forest darkness, I could trace the sinister outlines of some of those low mounds which characterized the lightning-pierced region. History had led me to this archaic grave. History, indeed, was all I had, after everything else ended in mocking Satanism. I now believed that the lurking fear was no material thing, but a wolf-fanged ghost that rode the midnight lightning. And I believed, because of the masses of the local tradition I had unearthed in search with Arthur Monroe, that the ghost was that of Jean Martinez, who died in 1762. This is why I was digging idiotically at his grave. The Martinez mansion was built in 1670 by Gerrit Martinez, a wealthy New Amsterdam merchant who disliked the changing order under British rule, and had constructed this magnificent domicile on a remote woodland summit whose untrodden solitude and unusual scenery pleased him. The only substantial disappointment encountered in this site was that which concerned the prevalence of violent thunderstorms in summer. When selecting the hill and building his mansion, Mynheer Martinez had laid these frequent natural outbursts to some peculiarity of the year, but in time he perceived that the locality was especially liable to such phenomena. At length, having found these storms injurious to his head, he fitted up a cellar into which he could retreat from their wildest pandemonium. Of Gerrit Martinez's descendants less is known than of himself, since they were all reared in hatred of the English civilization and trained to shun such of the colonists as accepted it. Their life was exceedingly secluded, and people declared that their isolation had made them heavy of speech and comprehension. In appearance, all were marked by a peculiar inherited dissimilarity of eyes, one generally being blue and the other brown. The social contacts grew fewer and fewer, till at last they took to intermarrying with the numerous menial class about the estate. Many of the crowded family degenerated, moved across the valley, and merged with the mongrel population which was later to produce the pitiful squatters. Wow, that's a good job, Lovecraft. That's not racist at all. The rest had stuck sullenly to their ancestral mansion, becoming more and more clannish and taciturn, yet developing nervous responsiveness to the frequent thunderstorms. Most of this information reached the outside world through young Jean Martinez, who from some kind of restlessness joined the colonial army when news of the Albany Convention reached Tempest Mountain. He was the first of Gerrit's descendants to see much of the world, and when he returned in 1760, after 6 years of campaigning, he was hated as an outsider by his father, uncles, and brothers. In spite of his dissimilar Martinez eyes, No longer could he share his peculiarities and prejudices of the Martinenses, while the very mountain thunderstorms failed to intoxicate him as they had before. Instead, his surroundings depressed him, and he frequently wrote to a friend in Albany of plans to leave the paternal roof. In the spring of 1763, Jonathan Gifford, the Albany friend of John Martinense, became worried by his correspondent's silence, especially in view of the conditions and quarrels at the Martinense mansion. Determined to visit John in person, he went into the mountains on horseback. His diary states that he reached Tempest Mountains on September 20th, finding the mansion in great decrepitude. The sullen, odd-eyed Martinenses, whose unclean animal aspect shocked him, told him in broken gutturals that John was dead. He had, they insisted, been struck by lightning the autumn before, and now lay buried behind the neglected, sunken gardens. They showed the visitor the grave, barren and devoid of markers. Something in the Martinense's manner gave Gifford a feeling of repulsion and suspicion, and a week later he returned with spade and mattock to explore the sepulchral spot. He found what he expected, a skull, crushed cruelly as if by savage blows. So returning to Albany, he openly charged the Martinenses with the murder of their kinsman. Legal evidence was lacking, but the story spread rapidly round the countryside. And from that time, the Martinenses were ostracized around the world. No one would deal with them, and their distant manor was shunned as an accursed place. Somehow, they managed to live on independently by the product of their estate, for occasional lights glimpsed from faraway hills attested their continued presence. These lights were seen as late as 1810, but towards the last, they became very infrequent. Meanwhile, there grew up about the mansion and the mountain a body of diabolic legendry. The place was avoided with doubled assiduousness, and invested with every whispered myth tradition could supply. It remained unvisited till 1816, when the continued absence of lights was noticed by the squatters. At that time, a party made investigations, finding the house deserted, and partly in ruins. There were no skeletons about, so the departure, rather than death, was inferred. The clan seemed to have left several years before, and improvised penthouses showed how numerous it had grown prior to its migration. Its cultural level had fallen very low, as proved by the decaying furniture and scattered silverware which must have been long abandoned when its owners left. But though the dreaded Martinenses were gone, the fear of the haunted house continued, and grew very acute when new and strange stories arose among the mountain descendants. And there it stood, deserted, feared, and linked with the vengeful ghost of Jean Martinense. There it still stood, on the night I dug in Jean Martinense's grave. I have described on my protracted digging as idiotic, and such indeed was, and in object and method. The coffin of Jean Martinense had soon been unearthed. It now only held dust and nitre. But in my fury to exhume his ghost, I delved irrationally and clumsily down beneath where he had lain. God knows what I expected to find. I only felt that I was digging in the grave of a man whose ghost stalked by night. It is impossible to say what monstrous death I had attained when my spade, and soon my feet, broke through the ground beneath. The event, under the circumstances, was tremendous, for in the existence of subterranean space here, my mad theories had terrible confirmation. My slight fall had extinguished the lantern, but I produced an electric pocket lamp and viewed the small horizontal tunnel which led away indefinitely in both directions. It was amply large enough for a man to wriggle through, and though no sane person would have tried it at the time, I forgot danger, reason, and cleanliness in my single-minded fever to unearth the lurking fear. Choosing the direction towards the house, I scrambled recklessly into the narrow burrow, squirming ahead blindly and rapidly, and flashing but seldom the lamp I kept before me. What language can describe the spectacle of a man lost in infinitely abysmal earth, pawing, twisting, wheezing, scrambling madly through the sunken convulsions of an immemorial blackness, without an idea of time, safety, direction, or definite object? There is something hideous in it, but that is what I did. I did it for so long that life faded into a far memory, and I became one with the moles and grubs of nighted depths. Indeed, it was only by accident that after interminable writhings I jarred my forgotten electric lamp alight, so that it shone eerily along the burrow of caked loam that stretched and curved ahead. I had been scrambling in this way for some time, so that my battery had burned very low, when the passage suddenly inclined sharply upward, altering my mode of progress, and as I raised my glance, it was without preparation that I saw, glistening in the distance, two demonic reflections of my expiring lamp, two reflections glowing with a baneful and unmistakable effulgence, and provoking maddeningly nebulous memories. I stopped automatically, though lacking in the brain to retreat. The eyes approached, yet of the thing that bore them I could distinguish only a claw. But what a claw! Then far overhead I heard a faint crashing which I recognized. It was the wild thunder of the mountain, raised to hysteric fury. I must have been crawling upward for some time, so that the surface was now quite near. And as the muffled thunder clattered, those eyes still stared with vacuous viciousness. Thank God I did not then know what it was, else I should have died. But I was saved by the very thunder that had summoned it, for after a hideous wait, there burst from the unseen outside sky one of those frequent mountainward bolts whose aftermath I had noticed here, and there as gashes as disturbed earth and fulgurites of various sizes. With cyclopean rage it tore through the soil above the damnable pit, blinding and deafening me, yet not wholly reducing me to a coma. In the chaos of the sliding, shifting earth, I clawed and floundered helplessly till the rain on my head steadied me, and I saw that I had come to the surface in a familiar spot, a steep, unforested place on the southwest slope of the mountain. Recurrent sheet lightnings illumined the tumbled ground, and the remains of the curious low hummock which had stretched down from the wooded higher slope, but there was nothing in the chaos to show my place of egress from the lethal catacomb. My brain was as great a chaos as the earth, and as a distant red glare burst on the landscape from the south, I hardly realized the horror that I had been through. But when 2 days later the squatters told me what the red glare meant, I felt more horror than that which the mould burrow and the claw and the eyes had given, more horror because of the overwhelming implications. In a hamlet 20 miles away, an orgy of fear had followed the bolt which brought me above ground, and a nameless thing had dropped from an overhanging tree into a weak-roofed cabin. It had done a deed, but the squatters had feared the cabin in a frenzy before it could escape. It had been doing that deed at the very moment the earth caved in on the thing with the claw and eyes. Part 4. The Horror in the Eyes. There can be nothing normal in the mind of one who, knowing what I knew of the horrors of Tempest Mountain, would seek alone. For the fear that lurked there, that at least 2 of the fear embodiments were destroyed, formed but a slight guarantee of mental and physical safety in this Acheron of multiform diabolism. Yet I continued my quest with even greater zeal as events and revelations became more monstrous. When 2 days after my frightful crawl through that crypt of the eyes and claw, I learned that a thing had malignly hovered 20 miles away at the same instant the eyes were glaring at me. I experienced virtual convulsions of fright, but that fright was so mixed with wonder and alluring grotesqueness that it was almost a pleasant sensation. Sometimes in the throes of a nightmare, when unseen powers whirl one over the roofs of some strange dead cities towards the growing chasm of Nice, it is a relief and even a delight to shriek wildly and throw oneself voluntarily along with the hideous vortex of dream doom into whatever bottomless gulf may yawn. And so it was with the walking nightmare of Tempest Mountain. The discovery that 2 monsters had hunted the spot gave me ultimately a mad craving to plunge into the very earth of that accursed region and with bare hands dig out the death that leered from every inch of the poisonous soil. As soon as possible, I visited the grave of Jean Martinez and dug vainly where I had before. Some extensive cave-in had obliterated all trace of the underground passage, while the rain had washed so much earth back into the excavation that I could not tell how deeply I had dug that other day. I likewise made a difficult trip to the distant hamlet where the death creature had been burnt, and was little repaid for my trouble. In the ashes of a fateful cabin I found several bones, but apparently none of the monsters. The squatters said the thing had only 1 victim, but in this I judged them inaccurate, since besides the complete skull of a human being there was another bony fragment which seemed certainly to belong to a human skull at some time. Though the rapid drop of the monster had been seen, no one could say just what the creature was like. Those who had glimpsed it called it simply a devil. Examining the great tree where it had lurked, I could discern no distinctive marks. Pardon me. I tried to find some trail into the black forest, but on this occasion could not stand the sight of those morbidly large boles, or of those vast serpent-like roots that twisted so malevolently before they sank into the earth. My next step was to re-examine with microscopic care the deserted hamlet where death had come most abundantly, and where Arthur Monroe had seen something he never lived to describe. Though my vain previous searches had been exceedingly minute, I now had new data to test. For my horrible grave crawl convinced me that at least one of the phases of the monstrosity had been an underground creature. This time, on the 14th of November, my quest concerned itself mostly with the slopes of Cone Mountain and Maple Hill, where they overlook the unfortunate hamlet, and I gave particular attention to the loose earth of the landslide legion on the latter eminence. The afternoon of my search brought nothing to light, and dusk came as I stood on Maple Hill looking down at the hamlet and across the valley to Tempest Mountain. There had been a gorgeous sunset, and now the moon came up, nearly full and shedding a silver flood over the plain, the distant mountainside, and the curious low mounds that rose here and there. It was a peaceful Arcadian scene, but knowing what it had hid, I hated it. I hated the mocking moon, the hypocritical plain, the festering mountain, and those sinister mounds. Everything seemed to me tainted with a loathsome contagion, and inspired by noxious alliance with distorted hidden powers. Presently, as I gazed abstractedly at the moonlit panorama, my eye became attracted by something singular in the nature and arrangement of a certain topographical element. Without having any exact knowledge of geology, I had from the first been interested in the odd mounds and hummocks of the region. I had noticed that they were pretty widely distributed around Tempest Mountain, though less numerous on the plain than near the hilltop itself, where prehistoric glaciation had doubtless found feebler opposition to its striking and fantastic caprices. Now, in the light of that low moon which cast long, weird shadows, it struck me forcibly that the various points and lines of the mound system had a peculiar relation to the summit of Tempest Mountain. That summit was undeniably a center from which the lines or rows of points radiated, indefinitely and irregularly, as if the whole of the unwholesome Martin's mansion had thrown visible tentacles of terror. The idea of such tentacles gave me an unexplained thrill. And I stopped to analyze my reason for believing these mounds glacial phenomena. The more I analyzed, the less I believed, and against my newly opened mind there began to beat a grotesque and horrible analogies, based on superficial aspects and upon my experience beneath the earth. Before I knew it, I was uttering frenzied and disjointed words to myself. My God, molehills! The damn place must be honeycombed. How many that night at the mansion they took Bennett and Toby first, on each side of us. Then I was digging frantically into the mound which had stretched nearest me, digging desperately, shiveringly, but almost jubilantly, digging, and at last shrieking aloud with some unplaced emotion, as I came upon a tunnel, or burrow, just like the one through which I had crawled on the other demonic night. After that I recall running, spade in hand, a hideous run across moonlit, mound-marked meadows and through diseased, precipitous abysses of haunted hillside forest, leaping, screaming, panting, bounding towards the terrible Martinez mansion. I recall digging unreasonably in all parts of the briar-choked cellar, digging to find the core and center of that malignant universe of mounds. And then I recall how I laughed when I stumbled on the passageway, the hole at the base of the old chimney, where the thick weeds grew and cast queer shadows in the light of the lone candle I had happened to have with me. What still remained in that hell hive, lurking and waiting for the thunder to arouse it, I did not know. 2 had been killed. Perhaps that had finished it. But still there remained that burning determination to reach the innermost secret of the fear, which I had once more come to deem definite, material, and organic. My indecisive speculation whether to explore the passages alone and immediately with my pocket light or try to assemble a band of squatters for the quest was interrupted after a time by a sudden rush of wind from the outside, which blew out the candle and left me in stark blackness. The moon no longer shone through the chinks and apertures above me, and with a sense of fateful alarm I heard the sinister and significant rumble of approaching thunder. A confusion of associated ideas possessed my brain, leading me to grope back towards the farthest corner of the cellar. My eyes, however, never turned away from the horrible opening at the base of the chimney, and I began to get glimpses of the crumbling bricks and unhealthy weeds as faint glows of lightning penetrated the weeds outside and illuminated the chinks in the upper wall. Every second I was consumed with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What would the storm call forth, or was there anything left for it to call? Guided by a lightning flash, I settled myself down behind a dense clump of vegetation, through which I could see the opening without being seen. If heaven is merciful, it will someday efface from my consciousness the sight that I saw, and let me live my last years in peace. I cannot sleep at night now, and have to take opiates when it thunders. The thing came abruptly and unannounced, a demon, a rat-like scurrying from pits remote, unimaginable, a hellish panting and stifled grunt. And then from that opening beneath the chimney a burst of multitudinous and leprous life, a loathsome night-spawned flood of organic corruption, more devastatingly hideous than the blackest conjurations of mortal madness and morbidity. Seething, stewing, surging, bubbling like serpent slime, it rolled up and out of that yawning hole, spreading like a septic contagion, and streaming from the cellar at every point of egress, streaming out to scatter through the accursed midnight forests and straw, and strew fear, madness, and death. God knows how many there were. There must have been thousands. To see the stream of them in that faint intermittent lightning was shocking. When they had thinned out enough to be glimpsed at separate organisms, I saw that they were dwarfed, deformed hairy devils or apes, monstrous and diabolic caricatures of the monkey tribe. They were so hideously silent. There was hardly a squeal when one of the last stragglers turned with the skill of a long practice to make a meal in a custom fashion on weaker competition. Others snapped up what it left and ate with slavering relish. Then, in spite of my days of frightened disgust, my morbid curiosity triumphed, and as the last of the monstrosities oozed up alone from that netherworld of unknown nightmares, I drew my automatic pistol and shot it under the cover of thunder. Shrieking, slithering torrential shadows of red, vicious madness, chasing one another through endless, ensanguished corridors of purple, fulgurous sky. Formless phantasms and kaleidoscopic mutations of a ghoulish, remembered scene. Forests of monstrous, overnourished oaks with serpent roots twisting and sucking unamiable juices from an earth verminous, with millions of cannibal devils, mound-like tentacles groping from underground nuclei of polypus reversion. Insane lightning over maligned, ivied walls and demon arcades, choked with fungus vegetation. Heaven be thanked for the instinct which led me unconscious to places where men dwell, to the peaceful village that slept under the calm stars of clearing skies. I had recovered enough in a week to send to Albany for a gang of men to blow up the Martinez mansion and the entire top of Tempest Mountain with dynamite. Stop up all the discoverable man burrows and destroy certain overnourished trees, whose very existence seemed an insult to sanity. I could sleep a little better after they had done this, but true rest will never come as long as I remember that nameless secret of the lurking fear. The thing will haunt me, for who can say the extermination is complete, and that analogous phenomena do not exist all over the world? Who can, with my knowledge, think of the Earth's unknown caverns without a nightmare dread of future possibilities? I cannot see a well or a subway entrance without shuddering. Why cannot the doctors give me something to make me sleep, or truly calm my brain when it thunders? What I saw in the glow of a flashlight after I shot the unspeakable, straggling object was so simple that almost a minute elapsed before I understood and went delirious. The object was a nauseous, a filthy, whitish gorilla thing with sharp yellow fangs and matted fur. It was the ultimate product of mammalian degeneration, the frightful outcome of isolated spawning, multiplication, and cannibal nutrition above and below the ground. The embodiment of all the snarling and chaos and grinning fear that lurk behind life. It had looked at me as it died, and its eyes had the same odd quality that marked those other eyes, which had stared at me underground and excited cloudy recollections. One eye was blue, the other was brown. They were the dissimilar Martinense eyes of the old legends, and I knew in one inundating cataclysm of voiceless horror, inundating I should say, what had become of the vanished family, the terrible and thunder-crazed house of Martinense. So it was inbreeding all along. My favorite kind of story. Well, I say that, but I believe what Lovecraft was trying to push there was people from lower classes clearly are less genetically equipped. What? Lovecraft. Oh. Every story, there's something. Like, I must admit, he's from his time, and I understand that. But even from his time, he was crazy about this sort of thing, about racism and all that sort of jazz. Oh well, it was an interesting idea anyway. I liked it personally, but by God, he's got to lay off the genes, you know. It's an interesting subject until it gets really racist. Right. Okay. We have 20 minutes. Let's go find a horror story from the internet. Maybe there'll be something I can read that's pretty good. What the heck was that? Let's see. Let's see if we can find something new. The website that I usually use to find things from sort of internet horror stories has been kind of changed a bit. I'm just thinking, because I've read a majority of these. The Sandman. Have I read The Sandman before? It's a pretty long story as well. Debating whether or not it would be 10 minutes. You know what? I think we should do this one. I don't think I've read it before. It seems pretty fun. We're going to do The Sandman. And this little story is by... Who wrote this? Who wrote this, please? Where is the author? I need to find him. Tamlin! There we go. Tamlin wrote this. Yeah, this might be a fun time. I've never read it before. You're in for a treat, as am I. Hopefully there's less racism. But then again, it's not Lovecraft, so we have a little bit more assurity with that. Lovecraft. Oh, Lovecraft. Right, okay. Let's get on with it. This is The Sandman. Go to bed and wait for the Sandman. Even as it came out of James's mouth, it seemed to him a strange thing to say, and he was not sure why he had. But for some reason it worked. Daniel went to bed. James was making... The next morning, though, he asked, "What does the Sandman look like?" James was making breakfast. Daniel sat at the table, short legs swinging under his chair. "Nothing really," James said. "It's just an expression." "What does it mean?" "Just something people say." He put a plate of eggs in front of Daniel and kissed him on the top of his head. He thought that'd be the end of it. Until he saw the Sandman for himself. He was getting ready for bed, and stopped by Daniel's room to check on him while he slept, as he often did. It was such a routine precaution that when he saw a pale, naked man sitting on the edge of Daniel's bed, rocking back and forth, it took a moment for him to process what he was seeing. He reacted the way any father would, of course. He ran to the room screaming, and for a moment he thought about attacking the intruder, but then the man on the bed turned. And that's when James saw it wasn't really a man. It was a pale, slithery thing, hairless and warped, its joints turned the wrong way and its body out of shape with itself. When it moved, it was like an insane marionette dancing on a stage. James froze. The skittering thing watched him. He felt spreading warmth and realized he's pissed his pants. Only when he remembered that Daniel was still there in bed, staring at that broken-shaped thing sitting a foot away, did he regain the courage to move. He grabbed Daniel and ran. In the hall, he turned to see if the thing would follow him, but it didn't. For a moment it watched, and then, moving like a stop-motion nightmare, it crawled to the window and jumped out, leaving only the billowing curtains to mark its passing. James had trouble talking to the police. He reported a break-in, but when asked to describe the intruder, he didn't know what to say. How could he make the ordinary man in a blue uniform sitting at his kitchen table while two of his colleagues searched the house understand a thing like he'd seen? He couldn't even understand it himself. To make it worse, Daniel's memory did not correspond to James's. He described an ordinary-looking burglar. "A man in a mask," he said. James thought about it. Had it been a mask? No, it would have had to have been a full costume, an elaborate one, something like they would use for a movie, and that would not explain the way it moved. But in the end, he simply echoed his son's testimony. "A man in a mask," he said. "A burglar." The lie unsettled him almost as much as what happened. The doctor said Daniel wasn't hurt and showed no signs of molestation. James was relieved. They stayed at a motel for a couple nights until they felt ready to come home. And then James had a new security system installed, along with bars on the windows. He didn't like the sight of them in Daniel's room, but it seemed like the right thing to do. James was frightened that the first night back in the house, but Daniel strangely was not. When asked if he felt okay sleeping alone, he just said yes. In the end, it was James who found himself wishing he was not sleeping alone. He was up all night, listening for the sound of anything moving in the house, although he had convinced himself that his memory was faulty, and that it had been a normal, albeit probably deeply disturbed man in his son's room. When he closed his eyes, even for a moment he pictured bloodless skin and a twisted, inhuman face. He found himself wondering, why my house? Why my family? He knew, of course, there didn't have to be a reason, but still, he wondered. 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped talking. James didn't notice at first. Kids went through quiet phases sometimes, but eventually he tried to get Daniel to talk. And he wouldn't. Eventually it became clear that he couldn't. Back to the doctor they went. Nothing wrong with him that we can see, was the diagnosis. Was it the trauma, James asked. Could be, they said. Sometimes these things come on late. Children can be a mystery even to those who know them best. They recommended a child psychologist whom James couldn't afford. He could not, for that matter, even afford the bill they were giving him now. Nothing seemed to help. Daniel would write out answers to questions sometimes, but never more than a yes or no. When James would ask him what was wrong, or if he'd seen or heard anything that frightened him, Daniel would only stare. He seemed furtive and bemused. James found himself missing the sound of his son's voice. Sometimes he wanted to hear it so bad he ached. But it seemed that Daniel would not talk again until he was ready. James had other things to worry about too. He was convinced, beyond reason, that the intruder was not really gone. Though the alarm never went off and the locks and bars remained undisturbed, he was sure he heard movement in the night. Not normal movement, it was a sound like a huge snake slithering through the house. When he heard it, he imagined horrible things. Nothing was ever there when he went to investigate, though. He often thought he glimpsed something just out of the corner of his eye, a pale foot, or a misshapen shadow that would slink away as soon as he turned. He rarely slept, and when he did, he had haunted dreams. Soon he realized he had not left the house in weeks, except to go to the bank and buy groceries. He felt hemmed in. With Daniel acting mute, he hadn't had an actual conversation with someone in weeks, so he called his mother. The connection was bad, and her voice sounded faint, on the verge of not being there at all. I guess I'm okay, Ma, he said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his palms, and then make sure he could hear Daniel playing in the next room. But things have been a little rough. We had a break-in. Oh, how awful, Mum said. Did they take anything? Nah, just ran off. It was weird, though. I haven't really felt comfortable since then. Are you still working at that hospital? No, Ma. I left last year. You know that. Oh. Well, have you been getting out? What about that nice woman you were seeing last year? The one who played the piano? James scowled. She was always asking that kind of thing. Didn't she know how hard it was being a single father? That he didn't have the time? He was about to say so when something made him pause. Ma? Is there anyone else on the line? I don't think so. James was sure he heard it. The short, gasping sound of someone trying to hold their breath and failing. A cold feeling crept across the back of his neck. You're sure nobody is listening on your other phone? Dear, there is no other phone. I'm on the cell. That's why the service is so bad. Then what is... James stopped. If the sound wasn't coming from her end, then... He dropped the phone and raced to the hall. The extension hung on its hook, undisturbed. Pounding, he hurled into the garbage. The spare phone sat on the workbench. Sorry, I'll repeat that. Heart-pounding, he hurtled into the garage. The spare phone sat on the workbench. No one was in sight. But could there have been? Could someone have been there all along, listening to his phone call and then slithered away? Might they even be here now? The next day, he took out the extra phone extensions. He even filled in the jacks with rubber cement. Daniel watched him work, eyes curious, but James offered him no explanation. He began giving Daniel a light physical exam every week. His CNA training was a little rusty after a year on disability, but you never really forget. It was an absurd thing to do, of course. Even if there was a physical cause for Daniel's behavior, it would be nothing if he could discover this way. And he was aware, on some level, that it was just compulsive behavior. Nevertheless, it made him feel better. One morning, James set the diaphragm on the stethoscope against Daniel's chest, but he could not locate a heartbeat. He moved to his hand in search of the right spot, to no avail. Then, to test it, he listened to his own heartbeat. It came through steady and clear. But when he checked Daniel again, he didn't hear anything. A thought came unbidden to him of the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, whose chest was as empty as a kettle. A sick feeling roiled his stomach. He threw the stethoscope down and grabbed Daniel by the shoulders, looking into his face. Daniel stared back with bright eyes. He even smiled a little, with the corners of his mouth. James felt the tingle of tears. He swept his son up in his arms and hugged him, and Daniel hugged back. Then James put his shirt back on him and sent him to play. The stethoscope, he decided, was broken. He threw it in the trash. Things got worse. James's terrors were no longer relegated to the long hours of the night. Now it seemed like some creeping, some skittering and scuttling, some unknowable noise in the dark corner or another filled every second of his day. The thought of how big the house really was started to weigh on him. There were so many rooms he wasn't in at any given time, so many places someone or something else could be. He imagined strange figures occupying the rest of his home when he wasn't around, melting into the walls or merging with the shadows whenever he turned on a light or opened a door. How would we know if he were there? How would we ever know? Soon he didn't even have to be outside of the room to imagine it. When he walked up the stairs, he pictured pale figures lurking beneath them. When he went down the hall, he pictured a crawling thing slithering behind the walls, shadowing his every step. If he sat too long in the same chair, he imagined that it was right behind him, and he was never comforted when he turned around and found nothing there, as he could only guess that it meant it had moved. Swiftly and silently behind him once again. Wherever he was not looking right now, that was where he imagined it to be. He was losing his mind, he knew. The only thing that helped him cling to sanity was that Daniel seemed undisturbed. Other than his muteness, his behavior was perfectly normal. And whenever he seemed to sense that his father was troubled, he would hug him, or squeeze his hand, or even smile. Sometimes when he left the room, James cried. One night he found himself creeping around the house with no lights on at 2 o'clock in the morning. If the intruding thing had taken to violating his daytime activities, then he would get revenge by confronting it on its own terms. The night. And really there was no more frightening to him now than day. They were almost interchangeable. He padded barefoot down the halls, up the stairs, in and out of disused rooms. Sometimes he stopped to listen, hoping to try and locate it by sound. It was a stealthy, creeping thing, he knew. But it was awkward at times, and it couldn't always keep its strangely shaped limbs from making their distinct, irregular footsteps. The smallest noise would give it away. There was one room he suspected it spent most of its time in. The spare bedroom. Not a bedroom at all, really. More like a closet, just large enough to accommodate a bed if one was so inclined. It was unpainted and uncarpeted and drafty. He always meant to fix it up. He didn't come in here very often because he did like the bare, unused look of it. It made him think of a partially dissected corpse. He came in now, though. If the thing made its nest any one place in the house, this would be it. Of course there was nothing there now. That didn't mean there was nothing there. He cursed, running a hand through his wet, damp hair. What was he missing? How did it hide from him? What was its secret? He peered into the room's empty corners one by one, getting his face a few inches from the plaster and floorboards so that he could be certain that there was no space for it to conceal itself. The light bulb flickered. He froze. My God, he thought, it's on the ceiling! He pictured it crawling above him like a huge pale lizard. That's how it gets around, he thought, and that's how it escapes every time I should have it cornered. It scuttles up the wall and hides right over my head. He imagined it dangling down behind me like a spider. If I turn around, he thought, it'll be there, hanging with its face right next to mine. He held its breath. He did not want to turn around, but he had no choice. It was between him and the door. With a quiet sob, he rounded on his heels. Of course, he was alone. There was no man on the ceiling. He checked twice. Maybe it had crawled out and was waiting for him in the hall, but when he checked, the coast was once again clear. It should have been a relief, but it was not. After all, it had to be in here somewhere. If the ceiling was not its trick, that it just meant that it was something else, something even more strange, even more clever. He went into Daniel's room. He had not stopped checking on him at night like he always had. This time, though, rather than open the door, he listened to it at first, pressing his ear against the grain of cheap wood and holding his breath, terrified that he would hear a skittering sound on the other side of the barrier. What he heard instead shocked him even more. Daniel was talking to someone. James recoiled for a second, and then when he caught his breath, he all but kicked the door in. Daniel was already awake indeed, sitting up in bed, but he was not saying anything now. The light flashed on, and James stalked halfway into the room before stopping, suddenly torn. What did he want more? To confirm that his son could speak again, or to find whoever he was speaking to? The creaking of the door hinge settled the matter for him. He ran into the closet and threw it open. There was nothing inside, or at least nothing that shouldn't be there. He swept aside clothes on their hangers, but nothing was hiding between them. Then he dragged the toy box out and emptied it on the floor. Nothing! He combed along the bare walls and the floor, and yes, the ceiling, pushing aside every last bit of rubbish and stray knickknacks so that he could be sure, absolutely sure, that nothing was hiding. All the while, Daniel watched him. After a few minutes, James was panting and covered in sweat, and the closet was bare, and there was neither intruders nor answers inside. It struck him as funny, somehow, and he started to laugh very quietly. He kicked his son's toys out of the way as he went to sit down on the bed, dazed. He became aware, all at once, of several things. First, being that he had not slept in days and was nowhere near his right mind. The second was how close he had come to really losing it. For good. Tomorrow he decided they would both sleep until the afternoon. And when they did wake up, he and Daniel would get out of this creaky old house. No more staying and cooped up like prisoners, and no more checkups, and no more dreams about monsters. He would even take the bars off the windows. It was time to get back to living. It was time to get back to living like real people again. It was time to... James saw it when he brushed a hand through Daniel's hair. He pulled Daniel, a little too roughly, closer. His son acquiesced to the exclamation without fidgeting or complaint as James pawed the side of his head, hoping that what he was seeing would somehow stop being apparent. He stared and stared until he ached from not blinking. But there was no denying what was right in front of his eyes. Daniel was missing an ear. He realized with mounting nausea, both ears. There was no injury, no incision, no mark where they should have been, simply smooth, blank flesh. As blank as Daniel's quiet, unperturbed demeanor. James swept him up in his arms and ran into the hall. He was not sure where he was going or what he meant to do when he got there, but he just knew there was now nothing more important than getting his son out of that house. But their path was cut off. A naked man sat in the hallway with his back to them. No, not a man. James recognized its stretched limbs and stooped shoulders. The pale thing squatted on its haunches, rocking back and forth like it was paralyzed. It almost seemed to be in pain. James hugged his son even closer and backed away. Then he heard Daniel's voice. "Daddy!" James turned to Daniel, and then he heard the voice again. "Daddy!" But Daniel's lips hadn't moved. James looked back at the haunched figure. Its head jerked when it talked, like a tick. "Hello, Daddy!" James' mouth went dry. It took several tries before he could speak. "Don't call me that!" "It is. This voice's name for you." "Go away. Leave my family alone." "But I am your family." The longer it talked, the more the voice became distorted and blurred. An icy feeling nestled in James's stomach. "Who are you?" "Someone who came to visit." "Why here?" "You invited me." James's heart thudded against the inside of his chest. "Why?" "I had something you wanted." James licked his dry lips. "You're lying. You don't have anything I want. I want you to leave. Leave and never come back." "Who is Daniel's mother?" James blinked. "What?" "Who is Daniel's mother?" "What the hell kind of question is that?" "How old is Daniel?" James blinked again. The thing's voice caused a pinching pain on the center of his forehead. "Stop asking me these things." "When is Daniel's birthday?" "I don't know." "What is his middle name?" "Shut up! What was his first word?" "I said shut up!" James wanted to tear the thing apart with his bare hands. Only the heaviness of Daniel in his arms kept him where he was. "You were alone. You wanted a son, so I made one for you." James's hands began to shake. "That doesn't make any sense. Made out of what?" "Out of myself." James's stomach turned over. "But now I need those parts back." Daniel picked at James's shoulder to get his attention. Something was strange about Daniel's face. "Danny, open your eyes." Daniel scrunched his eyes tighter. "Open your eyes. Danny! Danny, open your eyes! Open your eyes!" Daniel shook his head, trying to refuse, but he couldn't hold it forever. Eventually his eyelids flicked up and James saw the truth. Daniel's eyes were gone. James almost dropped him. For a second he wanted to throw his son down so that he could stop looking into those empty holes in his face. Daniel opened his mouth as to speak, but of course he had no voice. "He is coming back to be part of me again." No. Give him back. Give him back." "I cannot. It has been too long. I warned you this would happen." "You're lying. You're lying. You're a fucking liar. Give me my son back. Give him back." "I do not lie. I warned you he could not exist forever, but you do not remember. You can only remember what I want you to. You forget all the times we have talked. Daniel felt like a doll, or an empty bag. His hair was falling out, disappearing before it touched the ground. His hands vanished into his sleeves, and his feet rolled up inside its pants cuffs. James cradled the tiny, shapeless thing. Tears streamed down his face. Soon he held a pile of empty clothes. And then those two were gone. He looked around the house. Toys disappeared. Photos vanished from their frames. Daniel's little shoes were no longer by the door. James turned towards Daniel's room and confronted a wall where the door should be. He groped the blank surface, fingertips scrambling. He hit his head against the wall. The pain didn't feel real. Why did you do this? It was what you wanted. And I learned so much. This is impossible. People will ask. People will wonder. The police, the hospitals, the people in the neighborhood. They have already forgotten him. They only remembered what I wanted them to. Like you. James pressed his hands to his aching skull. Will I at least remember him after all this? You can try. But your mind will fail you. Now that everything he was is a part of me again. James sat on the floor, looking at the blank wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that thing creep towards him, and even felt its wet hand on his shoulder, but he did not look at it. If I won't remember any of this, he said, then why tell me? Because a father should know. And then James was alone. Abigail worried about James sometimes. When they met a year ago, he said that he'd never been married and he never had kids, but there was a certain pained expression he assumed when he said the last part. Abigail knew that look. She'd met parents who'd lost children before. You learn to recognize it. And there were other things that worried him about her too, that worried her too. Sometimes she would find him staring at a particular spot on the wall, brow furrowed in concentration. He did not seem to realize he was doing it. And of course there was insomnia, the sleepwalking to consider too. Yeah, there was a lot to worry about. But she loved him, all the same. James said he'd never had kids, and neither had she. She'd long wanted one, but it was impossible, and she'd worried that James wouldn't stay with a woman who couldn't be a mother, though he constantly assured her that was not so. There were times, and more often of late, they were the lights when James took to sleepwalking, and even Abigail imagined that she heard strange, scuttling noises in the house and saw impossible shapes in dark corners. When she thought she would do anything, absolutely anything, if it meant having a little daughter for she and James to raise. And at those moments, she became truly afraid. But she never knew why. Ooh, that was fun! I like that! That was really cool! There's a story about a little bit of mind messery, about a creature that gives you kids and then takes them away from you, because like the way that thing, like the way that it's written for me to speak like that, it's literally like, it's almost like word, stop, word, stop, word, stop. it was a really, so, oh god, that was, interesting. I liked it. I'm glad I've read that. Never read that before, but it was really, really fun. Is there any criticism I could give it? Maybe it would be better if there were more hints that James was like, no, not James, Daniel was not real. But like, that's really all I could say. It was a big twist, but there was no real lead up to it. I don't think that was noticeable, at least to me. Maybe I'm an insane person and I don't notice these things. But hey ho, there we go. That was that story called The Sandman by who was the guy again? Let me see who was it by. Who wrote that? Who did that thing? Tam Lin did that. What a fun time. Definitely worth your time to read that if you ever get the chance. It's pretty big. It took me like 30 minutes to read it. I enjoyed myself. So, hey, there we go. Anyway, I will say that is the end of the show right now. If you're listening to this on a recording, I am sorry for starting the recording halfway in. If you're listening to this live, I am sorry for interrupting the live broadcast to start recording things and explaining things. First time back, please excuse me for my mistakes. I'm really sorry, I'm bad at this. Anyway, yeah, thank you all for watching. If you want to listen to more of me, at 5 o'clock today, I am going to be presenting the new music show on R3, which is essentially me showing lots of new tracks and music that's being put out there into the world. It'll also be a sort of regular thing where we occasionally get bands in, and we get to show that they get to do their stuff, and that'd be fun. But apart from that, yeah. Thank you all for watching, everyone. It's been a real good time. I've been really enjoying myself. It's great to be back. I love doing this sort of thing. Yeah. I hope you had a good time. But above all, stay spooked.